Kathy Erb with Christian Connections for International Health. You mentioned that government officials did not put a lot of reliance on the social media, Facebook and Twitter. Was that any different for elected government officials that had constituents they might be more responsible to?
This was a general finding across the countries, regardless of whether people were elected or appointed. We had a couple of cases in France and in the UK where parliamentarians used Twitter to obtain feedback from their constituents and share their communication with their constituents. But generally, other policymakers do not use social media for development purposes.
If I could just, I think that also, leads to another, I mean, for me, a really fascinating aspect of the research, which to some extent seems to be a reaffirmation of traditional media. And I wondered if maybe you could just comment a little bit on that, that people are still actually using traditional media for much of their information. Now, obviously, we've focused on international development information, but I think there might be something to say there in terms of the fact that that not everything is online, and that there are some issues with respect to people's what they consider to be trustful sources of information as well, and that has not completely migrated online at this point. I don't know if you want to make any comments about that.
Only to say that the online sources that performed well in the study were also the online sources with big media brands. So the BBC website, the Guardian website, the New York Times website, the websites of the big media brands also did very well. So it isn't so much a media, it's not a old media versus new media argument. It's much more about the prominence of the big media, global media brands, which, because of the nature and the scope of their coverage, are bound to cover these topics that we were probing. So in some ways, that's not a surprise. I think what's more surprising is the point earlier that there are these efforts out there to provide content and information that nobody knows about. But just one added point, I think, and this was a much stronger recommendation in an earlier version of this report, was the opportunity to create a kind of a one-stop shop for content in this area, because it doesn't exist. The World Bank website has a particular focus, the UN websites have a particular focus, the big media brands are covering news stories in developing countries, but there is no one place as a citizen, if you had any level of interest at all in this area, that you would go to online. Now, whether that could be a portal that brought together lots of different sources, or filtered or digested the existing content out there. But there is no named entity here that's coming to the surface above all the other rather predictable ones. And I think we felt very strongly about that in the beginning, but we were finding we weren't getting a lot of resonance with it. Perhaps because it's too much to take on, but there's definitely a niche there. If, for example, we were to do this research in 5 years, would we expect to see the same named entities again, or could there be a new entity that would be identified as the source of information in this area, clarifying a lot of the issues around the confusion and the ambiguity around different aspects of the sector.
Hi, Karen Nussel with Ripple Communications. I have two questions. One is, since Paul brought up the Coney phenomenon, were there any incidents, if you will, during the time you were in the field that would have influenced some of the answers? In other words, was there some sort of anything globally that happened?
Recession. But that was the main one. But there was no one single incident in any of the countries that would skew the results. But recession obviously had huge impact on how people answered all of these questions. And Greece, for example, in Europe was on top of people's minds. But because when we were talking about developing countries, the first thing they asked was, are we talking about Greece or are we talking about something else? So that was the first thing we had to clarify, and recession definitely had a huge impact on that. If we did this research again in 5 years' time, probably the results would be slightly different because of that.
Okay, and then my second question sort of builds on Susan's point, and at the risk of upsetting the folks who funded this, I'm just curious as to what you would think the next natural step in this research would be. As a messaging person, there's been a lot of conversation here about messaging. Would it be to go back into the field and push a little bit and say, if you knew X, would that influence your feeling about these issues? That would be the traditional thing to do from a messaging perspective. So I'm just kind of interested to know what you think is would be the next phase of this.
Great question, Karen. Thank you. I have lots of things I'd like to do. One of the original ideas, and this is perhaps still in the pipeline, was that there would be a second phase of this research where we would go to 5 countries in the south. We would go to Brazil, India, South Africa, Nigeria, and perhaps another a 5th country where there would be emerging themes and issues, and they might be emerging donors. So we would have that perspective as well. And that seems like an obvious thing that we should do, and perhaps tweak a lot of the questions here, but not all of them, so that we would have some normative data. I think the really interesting piece of research is around storytelling and formats, and online formats, and video formats, and reality show formats that are about connecting people's stories, the fair trade with the coffee you buy in the shop, making those connections for people. There's some really, really interesting work that's done by a guy called Shanto Iyengar at Stanford, where he's looking at episodic frames and thematic frames. The episodic frames is where you're telling stories about Karen, or are you talking about stories about the statistics of the group that Karen has belonged to? So it's much more abstract. And the difference, when you're talking about the same story, the unemployed individual versus unemployment statistics, how people interpret their connection with that story. I think there's huge potential to explore storytelling techniques and formats with audiences in different cultural contexts, taking into account the competing narratives and addressing the competing narratives around corruption and transparency and responsibility, and building that in to essentially answer those questions for audiences. I also think, because of the power of traditional media brands, that there's an opportunity to showcase those formats on CNN, perhaps on Fox, on the BBC, and the Guardian is doing this to some extent with their development agenda online. But that's where I think the next phase is. But it's not around messaging per se. It's much broader than that, because I think it's got to embrace a much more of a strategic vision for where the sector wants to go, or the key players in the sector want to go. It has some messaging elements in it, but it's a much more holistic approach, I think, to really helping people understand these issues in a much more sophisticated but not complex way.
I'll just maybe, again, take advantage of the microphone passing in front of me. I was mentioning to someone, I don't know who from the One campaign brought out the idea. Think about all the money that's going to be spent for all of the conferences, Rio Plus 20, and all the other conferences that are going to happen on the way to the new MDGs or the new development goals or whatever the UN and the international community come up with. And what if you took some of that money and actually asked people from Nigeria to Kenya and all parts in between, and Latin America and Asia, asked what their development priorities were? Because I think that idea of also reframing the process. I was talking about the secret handshake. Moving, using some of the feedback and the research to influence the policy process about what is important and how it's done, I think, is a whole other angle. And in the extractive and the transparency area, it's very interesting that. From our point of view, we're very happy that the Obama administration is championing a number of these laws relating to transparency, that oil companies and others are supposed to publish, what they pay to developing country governments in regard to their oil projects. But he's also adopted, as Secretary of State Clinton has announced, that the U.S. will also be part of this extractive industry transparency initiative. So it's having an effect on the United States as well as developing countries. So I think that idea that more research, and particularly in our case, we actually did our own research on the oil boom in Africa beginning in the year 2000, 2001, and 2, in order to make sure that the people who were concerned about it, in this case our partners, secular, faith-based, and otherwise, that we had our own information and our own research to share about this, as opposed to just agreeing to campaign with others. So I think that the recommendation for independent research, both in terms of attitudes, but also about the very development issues that we're talking about, what works and what doesn't, the nature of corruption, I think that is a very strong recommendation, and I hope some of the money, whether it's in the stratosphere or here or in other places, does go to some of these follow-on projects.
Anybody else?
First, a quick comment kind of on the self-interest point that was being raised before. I'm Brian Kirchhoff from D3 Systems. We recently did a survey in South Sudan that one of the interesting findings that came out of that was that when we asked the South Sudanese people themselves which country you would most prefer to partner with, despite the fact that China has spent an awful lot of money on infrastructure development and oil infrastructure, and there's been a lot of Chinese dollars that have gone into the country, they came in practically last in terms of who you would prefer to partner with. So, and this isn't to say that we shouldn't be looking for opportunities to leverage that messaging internally and domestically, but I think that you also want to be careful how strongly you want to change that messaging over, because you could risk alienating some of your recipient partners if you start projecting the idea that we're only doing this for our self-interest too. And that was a comment. The second question was just a quick methodological question. How was cell phone methodology, or how were cell phones used? Was this only landlines, or were there cell phones included within the samples for the 4 countries that were done by cell phone, or done by phone?
They were included as well.
Okay, was it cell phone only, or was it?
It was both a combination of landline phones and mobile.
So, okay, that answers it. Thanks.
Just a quick response on, sorry, I didn't get you. Oh, Brian, on Brian's first question. I'm very familiar with South Sudan and with North Sudan, and I think if you had asked the policymakers that question about who they want their partners to be, I think China probably would have come higher on the list than it did for citizens, because citizens' experience of Chinese intervention in South and North Sudan is very different from the experience of the policymakers. So I think it speaks to the value of talking to groups.
Since you conveniently mentioned the China word, I mean, this is another really fascinating aspect of the research, the fact that you were able to do this kind of research in China, and I'm wondering if you could just comment a little bit on what the perceptions, you mentioned this a little bit in your presentation, but what seems to be the awareness or the perceptions of the concept of development, and also the role of China in that among Chinese themselves?
I think the interested citizens are still very much focused on China. They're not thinking about other countries at all. And there's a huge disconnect between them, influencers, and policymakers, because the last 2 groups are looking outward as well, and they're focusing especially on Africa. Yeah, I think that's it.
One detail on that: there was mention in the Chinese research of Africa's investments in Uganda, but purely in terms of financial investments, not aid or assistance. So the frame there is very much about self-interest.
Yeah, in the back. We'll take.
Hi, Liz Marcy with Bread for the World. I have one question and a couple of comments. The first question is around the government decision makers when it came to Twitter. Were Hill staffers included in that? Because I say that because the members never, I would say there are about 5 members that actually do their own tweets, and then the rest are their staffers. And the staffers, if you've worked on Capitol Hill, only get younger every year. And some of them are very, it depends on the office, but some offices are very plugged in. It's true, and I would agree with your research findings, that most don't go to Twitter to find resources or information. They go to get feedback from their constituents or to monitor if something is blown up. If someone is tweeting at their member of Congress, that's when they know that they need to tell their boss something bad is happening. So that was the question. And then the 2 comments are related to this issue of kind kind of self-interest messaging. With Bread, we are a faith-based organization as well. We cover the entire Christian spectrum. What we have found with our members is that the moral argument is what works. Security and the economic argument, which we have fantastic data on, doesn't work. But that works fantastically for Capitol Hill. And it's not what motivates votes, actually. What motivates a member of Congress to vote is their moral argument as well. But that's what they will cite on the floor. And that's a very nuanced issue of messaging. So when we rally our troops on the ground to call their member of Congress, it's often to say, please use the following talking points, and at the very top is saving lives, and the following are security and economic. And lo and behold, somewhere in the speech, someone will say something about this is the right thing to do, but the first thing that leads is security, and the second is economic. And the first thing I say to members of Congress who are particularly interested in issues of economic development is they don't have a development agency. It has gone through their Department of Commerce. And that, I wonder if that was brought up at all when you talk to people, if that you think has a significant impact on how people view the issue of investment versus actual charity and that dynamic across the board.
Well, the answer to the first question is yes. We have interviewed both members of House and Senate as well as their staffers, so we had people on different levels. With regards to the second question, in China, none of the target groups talk about aid. They talk about investment, as I mentioned before. So aid is not even on the agenda. We're giving money to other countries, and we expect something back. What was interesting in China as well, the influentials, unlike in the other countries, they don't have a lot of communication with government decision makers. So they have very little influence on what government decision makers in China are thinking about and how they act. Initially, we wanted to do interviews with government decision makers in China, but it was completely impossible. And we had quite a few people that we wanted to speak with at the Ministry of Commerce, because that's where, as you say, the action happens. But it was really not possible for us to do that.
Is it possible to, even though we're here at Gates, is it possible to mention what you perceive as Gates' interest in China? What were they trying to understand in that context?
Thanks, Clara. I think it's obvious. I think the foundation has a presence in China, and there wasn't a lot of data on these questions gathered before, and I think I hope. And we'll know as soon as we have a clearer sense of whether we're going to be presenting there or not, that this will inform their thinking and their relationship strategy in China, but because it's a completely different landscape. Avahan in India is a completely different landscape than the Foundation's work in Africa. And I think that sensitivity to the political and the economic environment is so particular for each country, particularly for a large foundation like the Gates Foundation. They've got to be very, very nuanced and subtle in all those relationships because it's so high profile. And I would hope that this research would inform that strategy. That sounds like a political answer.
Do you have a Twitter question for us?
Yeah, we actually have a question that came in from Kenya.
Wow.
They're following. I've been live tweeting. That's why I have my phone.
That's Kelsey Glover, by the way, our communications intern.
Hi.
She can do things like Twitter that I can't.
Basically, it says, how do we better communicate with the public in developed nations about how much money is spent on aid and change perceptions that they're spending too much?
Well, first, I think one of the things that is intriguing, I was mentioning this in terms of Kenya, is the Kenyans for Kenya fundraising program that happened in the drought. It's interesting to see what's happening in terms of within Kenya itself. But in terms of changing those perceptions, one what we hope will be a continuing and a positive trend is donors have committed to more transparency about their aid programs. If that just ends up in a website where it's really hard and you have to have experts to dig around, then that's not it. But if they begin sharing those, those numbers in terms of if the U.S. government starts to share the breadth and the depth of its funding in Kenya with Kenyans and with Kenyan organizations and not just the Kenyan government, I think that's one positive. And then what we've been trying to do Bread for the World, organizations like ours, and others in the room have been trying to express not only how much a small part of the U.S. budget it is, but also how we are working in collaboration and in partnership with Kenyan organizations who are bringing their own resources. So I'm not sure if I answered the question directly, but I think there's a number of opportunities to, to show all the donor money that's going and where it's going, and international NGOs are going to be asked also to contribute, because according to the Hudson Institute, U.S. private organizations, not-for-profit foundations, and NGOs contribute over $10 billion a year to international causes and issues. So we also need to be more transparent about what we are funding. Whether that's going to show that we're spending too little or too much or in the wrong way, it will also take campaigners and analysts in Kenya and here to look at that data and to draw conclusions. So,
just one other footnote that I think informs Paul's response is that if you look across the data across the 5 countries, there's a relatively high proportion of people who believe that the investments their countries have made in developing countries has not had a great impact. And at the same time, there's a high proportion who believe they're not doing enough, right? So there's a potential contradiction there. And actually, one of the ways we've interpreted that is that there is a sense in the part of citizens of the scale of the problem, right? What you're trying to address is so big that even though we're not having an impact, we still need to do more. That's not a reason to do less. Now, that hypothesis would have to be tested, but that was our interpretation, particularly informed by the qualitative work as well.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap up because we're going to get kicked out of this room imminently. But I wanted to thank the speakers for a fascinating presentation and a great discussion with the audience. I think it's clear that particularly in the current environment here in Washington, the issue of how to connect with key groups in the development discussion is a timely topic and is open to a lot of debate and thinking. I also welcome everybody to go to AudienceScapes, where we have the building support site, where you can access all the documents as well as make comments and have discussions. It's at audiencescapes.org/build support. We also, as I mentioned, we have a Twitter feed, and the hashtag is support4dev. You're welcome to contribute to that as well. And I also just want to mention that the project that we have just presented is an example of the kind of work that InterMedia does to help organizations in development as well as in government and in media to understand how people use and need and what their needs are in information and communication, as well as in communication technologies as well. And I welcome you to visit our website to find out more about our company. Thanks again for coming.